This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.
He was calling Fox News fake news and a propaganda machine, and with what I saw, I'm like, that's pretty much what CNN was. Like, it's just pumping out propaganda.
Welcome to America Daily. I'm Jessica Beatty. Project Veritas, whose mission is to investigate and expose misconduct, published hidden camera footage Monday exposing anti-Trump bias at CNN, and it's coming from the very top. Project Veritas is known for its undercover Planned Parenthood videos, and more recently, it's been known for social media insider interviews, but this is considered its biggest story of the year. The insider, Cary Poarch, works at CNN's Washington, D.C. bureau. Here's a clip from Project Veritas' video on why he decided to come forward.
CNN likes to call itself the most trusted name in news, but that's not the story we heard from a CNN insider who blew the whistle, recorded everything, and came to Project Veritas earlier this year. Would it be fair to say that you being here today it's not politically motivated?
That's correct. It's not politics that motivates me. It's basically me wanting the news to be what they used to be, news, and not a infotainment or a game show or chasing the ratings like CNN purports it to be facts first, and that's clearly not the case.
Cary Poarch has worked for CNN for 2 years. He says when he started, he had high hopes for the job, but he quickly became disillusioned as he was exposed to rampant anti-Trump bias at the network.
I noticed after, again, this is fairly rapidly after I started, within the first 3 to 6 months, that there was a strong groupthink that permeated through the halls, and that everyone was on board the, I hate Trump train, or I want to, basically go after anyone, on the center or on the right politically.
Some notable parts of the interview show how the president of CNN, Jeff Zucker, directed staffers to push the impeachment narrative during his daily calls. In one call, Zucker attacked Fox News. He called it fake and destructive for America. CNN's vice president and political director complained about Republicans, saying, quote, "I think as big of a story as what President Trump has done here is the Republicans' sort of either delusional or defiant or silent responses," end quote. According to Project Veritas reporter James O'Keefe, despite nearly 200,000 tweets about #ExposeCNN, it wasn't trending. The topics that were trending didn't have nearly as many tweets, suggesting Twitter was censoring. Here to discuss the CNN whistleblower interview is our new team member, Vanessa Rios Gomez. She's a news writer and covers politics. Vanessa, thanks so much for joining us. So what I found really surprising about all this is that the anti-Trump bias was coming from the very top. And in some of the undercover footage from CNN media coordinator Nick Neville, he was saying that a lot of people at CNN are actually trying to do their best to keep their journalistic integrity. And then he said, quote, "Jeff Zucker, basically president of CNN, has a personal vendetta against Trump. Your own biases are going to be there. They're going to seep into what you think. They're going to seep into what you say. So if Jeff Zucker blatantly hates Trump and he runs CNN, which he does, it's not going to be positive. I mean, it's not going to be positive for Trump. He hates him. It's going to be negative," end quote. So personal vendetta sounds pretty serious. So Vanessa, you're a news writer and you cover politics. What do you think about journalistic integrity now? I mean, what did journalism used to be like compared to right now?
So when it comes to reporting, the objectivity that originally evolved, it didn't imply that journalists were free of bias. Rather, the impartiality had to do with how information was obtained. So, there was a specific and transparent approach. And that was basically to keep personal and cultural biases from coloring the news that is reported. So as a reporter, we seek out witnesses, multiple, not just, everybody on one camp who's just certain that this person did it or whatnot. We try to be objective and get both sides of a story. And so those are the standards that we work with. But for the journalist to completely be impartial, it's really difficult to say, don't have any moral judgment. Don't judge this at all. Don't think about whether someone is a bad guy or not, because inherently as human beings, we have that understanding of what is right or wrong. And in fact, that's one of the mainstays of journalism, is to point out what's wrong with the world, what needs to be fixed, as well as of course some of the good things that happen. But a lot of it is focused on what's wrong, what's bad out there that we need to address. And at some point, that objectivity that we needed to have in order to obtain this information was confused with having no bias whatsoever. So in terms of what's happening with journalism today, we're returning to that tradition of having a specific bias. But I don't think that's ever really quite left. I mean, for many years, I remember seeing in the newspapers declaring on the front page who the editors are endorsing for president. And that wasn't seen as a bad thing, but somehow we got confused.
So what's the difference between what you just mentioned, newspaper editors endorsing candidates, and what's going on in the mainstream media now?
I think they're not as transparent. Mainstream media are not as transparent as they should be. And they really should. They should come out, because I think if they do, people can decide, can actually see what's going on. There really is a strong bias in the media. I mean, the mainstream media kind of have a monopoly over what people see. And when you have the majority giving just one point of view, it's really unfair and unbalanced. And it, at that point, is manipulating societal thinking on a grand level. Because we're not, as journalists, we try to give the truth. So if mainstream media are using a specific bias, like in this case with CNN being anti-Trump, it's just not right. It's not professional. I mean, they're entitled to their opinion, and so, the way the system is set up, we're allowed to give our opinion. We're allowed to do that. But when you write articles and you disseminate them as news, but they're really opinion, and they're worded a certain way, and the directives are given from the higher up, be anti-Trump, it really is manipulating the system, manipulating the government, our elections. And this is my opinion.
Was there anything that surprised you about the hidden camera footage?
Unfortunately, no. I think I was just most surprised by the courage of Cary Poarch, and because basically he's pretty much blacklisted himself with this by making himself somewhat of a whistleblower.
Yeah, and the CNN insider said he was actually inspired by a previous whistleblower who came forward on Project Veritas. He was really brave to show his face and, put himself out there, which is a huge contrast to the anonymous whistleblowers that, the Democrats are using. It's just interesting to see that difference.
And I actually think that that's the direction that journalism is taking, because we're returning to truth. I would say, these journalists who are taking these risks are doing it based on a moral impetus. They know it's wrong, and somehow there's a lot of support, and I think that's why they're becoming brave enough to do it. At one point, there was just no audience for this. people were called conspiracy theorists or liars.
So what this CNN insider footage reminded me of was a recent Trump rally in Minnesota, and Subverse News interviewed a Trump supporter who's been to dozens of rallies, and what he was saying is that we're in a psychological civil war right now. So he said he sees lots of young people who have signs that and think the president is racist, even after he passed the First Step Act and prison reform, which, benefits the Black community. So the CNN insider footage made me think of this because I come across a lot of people who hate the president so much that you can't really have a discussion about it. And I was wondering if we're so divided because of the media. If a big boss at CNN hates the president and he's telling everyone to report negatively on the president, then that's just going to seep into everybody else's mind, I was just wondering what you think of that.
I agree. I've encountered the same thing. Where people, family, friends tell me they hate Trump. And so, I've covered some political news and I researched. I tried to find reasons to dislike Trump. And the more I reported on what was happening, what the White House administration was changing in American policy, what their directives were, what they were working towards, the more I started liking the presidency, this presidency specifically, and it started puzzling me. So I started asking friends and family, like, well, what exactly do you hate about him? And they'd say he's racist. And I'd kind of point out, okay, well, can you give me an example of something he's done? And I think that, him wanting to build this wall and keep out illegal immigrants or only allow certain amounts and be more tough with asylum seekers. They think that this is a sign of racism. And when I point out to them that previous administrations, presidents have been very vocal and active in doing the exact same thing, I point out the numbers of how many people were deported and or arrested. And it's although there has been an emergency, there's been I would say a concerted effort by invisible secret organizations, not even secret so much anymore, but like the People Without Borders. So with family and friends, my giving them the facts wasn't enough. There was this sentimental, very strong emotional reaction, visceral, and I really do blame the media. And CNN plays 24 hours a day. People want to see what's going on. They turn on the TV and they see the news, and the news is repeating the same thing over and over and over again. There aren't very many outlets who are reporting fairly and unbiased.
So do you think this CNN footage will have a big impact, or will the mainstream media kind of ignore it and hope it just goes away?
It doesn't look good. Of course, I don't think CNN's going to acknowledge it very much, if at all. It just doesn't behoove them to acknowledge what's going on. And as usual, if it's not part of their directive, then they're just not going to give it airtime. Because I think for them to give this airtime, they might acknowledge it and just pretty much say, no, this is not true. But the evidence is there. It's glaringly there, and we see it. I hope that they see this and they start thinking for themselves again. There's a lot of inherent trust in these large outlets, media outlets, and it's unfortunate that they have lost their objectivity.
Well, Vanessa, I'm so glad you've joined the team. We're lucky to have you, and thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Coming up next, Chris Chappell from America Uncovered digs into the origins of the opioid crisis.
The United States is in the throes of an opioid epidemic. Some are calling it a public health emergency. But how did this happen? And what's being done to address the rise in opioid addiction? This is America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. There is a public health crisis going on in America. I'm talking about the rise in opioid use and addiction in America today. It's been called perhaps the greatest public health crisis of our time. For the uninitiated, opioids are a class of drugs that act as powerful painkillers. Opioids were originally derived from opium poppies, but now there are synthetic or semi-synthetic opioids as well. In other words, opioids may be classified as a downer. There are natural types of opioids that come from poppy plants. Those include codeine and morphine. There are also partly synthetic opioids like oxycodone and hydrocodone, also known as OxyContin and Vicodin. Those are made in labs and blend natural and synthetic components. Heroin is also partly synthetic. Then, as if that wasn't powerful enough, there are fully synthetic opioids like fentanyl. It was originally developed as a pain reliever for people who had undergone surgical procedures. Fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more powerful than morphine. To put this into perspective, morphine is like driving your Ferrari 120 miles per hour, while fentanyl is like a gazelle, piloting an F-16 fighter jet, while on crack. The death toll from opioid use has been enormous. According to the CDC, since 1999, almost 400,000 Americans have died from an opioid overdose. And if all this isn't making you teeter on the brink of a breakdown, also consider that on average, 130 people die from an opioid overdose every single day. So, how did we get here? How did opioids become such a public health concern in a country with such an advanced medical system? The answer to these questions goes back over 30 years. Before the 1980s, doctors were wary about prescribing opioids long-term because of the risk of addiction. Then, there was an effort from drug companies to change that. Drug companies who just happened to be manufacturing new opioids. In 1980, two doctors published a one-paragraph letter to the editor in the New England Journal of Medicine. The letter said that in over 10,000 patients taking opioids in a hospital, only 4 patients with no history of addiction became addicted. The doctors concluded that despite widespread use of narcotic drugs in hospitals, the development of addiction is rare in medical patients with no history of addiction. And in 1986, a small study was published that argued that prescription opioids could be prescribed for chronic pain safely. Yeah, oops. That study was based on only 38 patients. And the letter to the editor only looked at patients given opioids in a hospital, not long-term. But these studies and others were used by drug companies to convince doctors that opioids were safe to use long-term.
They don't wear out, they go on working, they do not have serious medical side effects. And so these drugs, which I repeat are our best, strongest pain medications, should be used much more than they are for patients in pain.
Remember, the 1990s were huge for the drug industry. According to this report by the American Journal of Public Health, the 1990s also saw a rise in reports of chronic pain. As a result, drug companies began manufacturing opioids at rates that would make El Chapo proud. Folks, I'm starting to think drug companies might not be in it for the little guy. Fast forward a generation, and the financial and health costs have been more staggering than Charlie Sheen at an airport bar. In 2017 alone, 191 million opioid prescriptions were dispensed. That same year, 1.7 million people were addicted to prescription opioids. In terms of just health costs, Estimates place the price tag of the opioid epidemic since 2001 at higher than $216 billion. The financial cost of the opioid crisis, however, does not account for the devastating human toll. Several studies have found the opioid crisis to be particularly acute in rural America, where it's easier to get prescription opioids. And there's a larger issue. According to one article in the American Journal of Public Health, the crisis around opioids is fundamentally fueled by economic and social upheaval, its etiology closely linked to the role of opioids as a refuge from physical and psychological trauma, concentrated disadvantage, isolation, and hopelessness. If you're like me, you're not only appalled at those findings, but you also had to Google what etiology means. It means cause. Why don't they just say cause? Anyway, the overpriced U.S. medical system often favors quick answers to complex health-related issues. There's also the gateway drug problem. That's where users of prescription opioids make the quick jump from opioids to drugs like heroin. This often occurs because heroin is both cheaper and is easier to get on the street than prescriptions from a doctor's office. In studies, 80% of heroin users report having used prescription opioids first. In such a sea of depressing news, it's only natural to look for the villain of a situation, someone who deserves the blame, who we can actually feel good about shaming. Which brings us to the Sackler family. They're the people Marvel Comics' Brotherhood of Evil Mutants was modeled after. The Sacklers head the company Purdue Pharma. In the 1980s and 90s, Purdue came to prominence for developing opioids such as OxyContin. Now I know what you're thinking. Chris, what's so bad about developing extremely addicting pharmaceuticals that destroy communities and take hundreds of thousands of lives? I mean, is that even the company's fault that people get addicted to their substances? The Sackler family, whose estimated worth in 2016 was $16 billion, was allegedly aware that the substances they developed would be highly addictive. So, how did they solve this? Simple. They developed a PR strategy that would blame people who became addicted. Strap in, folks. We've barely crossed over into the depressing stuff yet. So, according to a complaint filed by the Massachusetts Attorney General, the Sackler family directed Purdue Pharma to pressure doctors to prescribe OxyContin in heavy doses and to keep patients taking it for longer than necessary, even when the company knew that the substance was dangerous and addictive. If that's true, it just goes to show that there's no limit to what you can accomplish when you're not hobbled by basic human decency. And if that wasn't enough, the then president of the company, Richard Sackler, wrote in a 2001 email, "We have to hammer on abusers in every possible way. They are the culprits and the problem. They are reckless criminals." In what will come as a surprise perhaps only to the Sacklers themselves, Purdue Pharma is facing legal action from over 2,600 state and local governments over its role in the opioid crisis. This is following a 2007 lawsuit in which Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to misleading patients, doctors, and regulators about the risks posed by their substances. 3 of the company's executives were forced to pay around $35 million in fines and complete 400 hours of community service. We can only imagine what the court proceedings must have been like. For the crime of defrauding doctors and vulnerable patients, you are hereby sentenced to... Just kidding. You're filthy rich, so I'm going to let this one slide. Purdue Pharma looked to settle the thousands of more recent lawsuits through a payment of between $10 to $12 billion and a declaration of bankruptcy.
New details tonight about how much the billionaire Sackler family is willing to pay to settle thousands of lawsuits stemming from the opioid crisis.
CBS News has learned that members of the Sackler family who own Purdue are willing to give up ownership of the company and pay an additional $3 billion to $4.5 billion from their personal wealth.
But the Sackler family has threatened to withdraw their pledge to pay the $3+ billion of their personal wealth unless a bankruptcy judge halts all the outstanding lawsuits against the family and Purdue Pharma. A legal complaint filed by lawyers for Purdue Pharma on September 18th blasted the roughly 24 states that have not signed on to the larger settlement. Those states are pressing forward with more lawsuits to get larger sums from the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma. According to Purdue's complaint, That continuing litigation will destroy hundreds of millions of dollars or more of value available for all claimants and for the public. And if the Sacklers have to face more lawsuits from states, the family may be unwilling or unable to make the billions of dollars of contributions called for in the original settlement. So just so we have this right, a group of people worth $16 billion are saying a settlement in which they would have to pay $3 or $4 billion is too high because of all the other lawsuits they're having to handle, and that if the deal falls through, it'll be the fault of the states seeking redress for an opioid crisis that was, in part, the family's creation. For their part, Purdue Pharma sees themselves as being treated unfairly and will not admit to any wrongdoing. They claim that the opioid crisis is more the fault of heroin and fentanyl because those substances have resulted in greater numbers of overdose deaths than OxyContin. Yes, that's how good and bad works. If I murder 5 people and my neighbor murders 20, then my murders don't really count. The states that are holding out for more from Purdue say that the deal on the table should go further to address the horrors of the opioid crisis, which means that in this situation, the politicians are the good guys. The state officials point out that the current deal contains nothing in the way of addiction treatment centers or alternatives for pain abatement medication. And they complain that many of the addiction treatment medications put forward by Purdue Pharma are not covered by insurance companies. The states reportedly also want to target the Sackler family's personal fortune, saying that there is much more there than could be provided by the company alone. And they accuse the family of hiding much of their wealth in offshore accounts. Yes, with each new detail, it's clear why the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants was modeled after the Sacklers. As depressing as all of this sounds, there is a road ahead for those seeking redress for the opioid epidemic, at least with another pharmaceutical company, Johnson & Johnson. An August ruling by an Oklahoma judge found that the marketing tactics of Johnson & Johnson were misleading to the public and contributed to the opioid epidemic. I know, as if the story wasn't depressing enough, Johnson & Johnson evidently makes more than just baby powder. The decision was the culmination of the first state opioid case to make it to trial. It puts Johnson & Johnson and its subsidiary on the hook for over $572 million. While significant, that's still a ways away from solving either Oklahoma's opioid crisis or my student loan debt. Nevertheless, the Oklahoma finding is a big deal. According to one doctor and opioid researcher, the case should be seen as the first time a court has ruled that opioid manufacturers are responsible for an epidemic of addiction and overdose deaths. Observers now believe that a new wave of lawsuits, starting with the Johnson & Johnson decision, could follow the lead of tobacco lawsuits of the 1990s, which targeted tobacco companies for what were deemed to be deceptive marketing practices and for the effects of cigarette smoking. Yes, it turns out cigarettes are bad for you. There even appear to be promising developments from the Trump administration, which recently announced a series of state and community grants totaling $1.8 billion that would go toward battling the opioid epidemic. Well, folks, we made it through, and we're still here. What do you think about America's opioid epidemic? Leave your comments below. Thanks for listening to America Uncovered. You can also watch our video episodes at youtube.com/America Uncovered. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Tune in next time.
This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.